When you picture the American West, what comes to mind? Probably cowboys, right? Rugged individuals, these huge, wide open spaces. But the real story? It's a lot more complicated than that. It's really a story of massive industry, government power, and some pretty profound human consequences. So let's get into it. Right at the heart of this whole thing is this tension between two completely different stories. Is it this heroic tale of progress, manifest destiny and all that? Or is it a pretty brutal story of conquest and people being pushed off their land? The thing is, and this is what we're going to explore, it was actually both. And you absolutely cannot pull them apart. All right, so where do we even begin with a story this big? Well, it all starts with the single biggest engine of change, the one thing that completely reshaped the continent. And that's the railroad. I mean, it wasn't just part of what happened out west. In a lot of ways, the railroad was the story. And you don't have to take my word for it. There's this quote from a booster back in the 19th century, and it just says it all. Everything, the new settlements, the economy, the literal shape of the West we know today, it was all driven by these iron tracks being laid across the country. And this is where we really need to kind of reframe how we think about railroads. They weren't just trains. They were the big tech of their day. Seriously, this was the first modern business enterprise, operating on a scale nobody had ever seen before. It needed huge, huge amounts of money and a totally new way of managing a company. So, where did all that money come from? Well, a gigantic chunk of it came from massive government handouts. Get this, between 1850 and 1871, the government just gave railroad companies over 175 million acres of public land. 175 million acres. To give you some perspective, that's an area bigger than the entire state of Texas. Just given away. And the growth that followed was just explosive. Think about it. In 1850, the whole U.S. had maybe 9,000 miles of railroad track, and most of that was back east. Okay, now fast forward just 50 years. By 1900, that number had jumped to over 190,000 miles. That's not just growth, that's a revolution. The entire continent was basically rewired in just a couple of decades. Of course, building all this track took a mind-boggling amount of human effort. By 1880, you had something like 400,000 men working for the railroads. That's nearly 2.5% of the entire nation's workforce. And a huge portion of these workers were immigrants, especially from Ireland and China. They took on the most dangerous, lowest-paying jobs you can imagine. We're talking about jobs like the brakemen, who literally had to run along the tops of moving trains to do their job. Just incredible. And the peak of all this work, the big moment, came in 1869 in Utah. The Transcontinental Railroad was finally linked. The whole nation celebrated. It was this huge symbol of unity and technological power. But you have to ask, who was this a triumph for? Because if you were already living in the West, that celebration probably sounded a lot different. Yeah, because for every single mile of track that was laid down, for every new town that popped up out of nowhere, there was a devastating human cost. This idea of progress, it came at the direct expense of the people who had called these lands home for centuries. Think of the railroad as the main artery of this expansion. It pumped settlers, supplies, and soldiers right into the heart of native lands. So what one group saw as a fantastic new connection, another group saw, rightfully, as an invasion. And it kicked off a period of just immense violence and loss. I mean, look at the story of the Navajo's Long Walk. It's just a harrowing example. The U.S. Army was ordered to clear the way for expansion, and so they forced the entire Navajo population on a series of brutal 300-mile marches to this desolate reservation. Thousands died from disease and starvation. Eventually, the government realized the whole policy was an inhumane disaster and a costly one, so they signed a treaty, which was pretty unprecedented, that actually allowed the Navajo people to return to their homeland. And as awful as that was, the devastation was even more stark in other places. Take California. Before the gold rush, the native population was about 150,000 people. By 1880, it had collapsed to fewer than 20,000. That's a drop of almost 90%. 90 in just a couple of decades. So what happened? How does that happen? Well, it was a horrifying mix of violence, disease, and just brutal policies. Get this. California state law actually allowed white settlers to take native adults and even children as so-called apprentice laborers. It was basically a loophole for slave labor, and it was used to build up the state's new industries. You can really feel the weight of all this struggle and exhaustion in the famous words of Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. He led his people on this desperate 1,000-mile flight from the U.S. cavalry, trying to reach safety. And when he finally surrendered, his speech just became this heartbreaking testament to the tragedy of the whole era. Okay, so with these lands now, well, opened up and tragically emptied, the railroad made it possible for a completely new economic system to take root. And this new system is where some of the most famous myths of the American West were born.
So let's trace how this all worked, because it's pretty brilliant in a way. The railroad created what was basically a continent-wide food chain. You've got cattle being raised down on the Texas plains. Cowboys drive those herds north to these new railroad towns in Kansas. From there, the cattle get shipped by train to Chicago, where they're processed in these enormous stockyards. And finally, the packaged meat gets sent in brand new refrigerated rail cars to feed the huge, growing cities back east.
And the driver behind this whole thing? It was pure, simple profit. The numbers are just wild. Right after the Civil War, you could buy a steer in Texas for about $4. But if you could get that same steer up to a rail hub in Kansas, it was worth $40. That's a 10 times return on your investment. That incredible markup is what created the legendary and very profitable cattle drives. But this brings us to the cowboy, and the reality is so different from the John Wayne myth. For starters, the workforce was incredibly diverse. About a quarter of all cowboys were African American, and even more were Mexican American. The pay was low, the work was brutal, and a ton of their gear and techniques, the whole culture really, was borrowed directly from Mexican vaqueros. And the wildest part? This whole famous era of the cattle drive, it lasted for less than 20 years. Then the railroads just kept expanding and made the long drives totally unnecessary. So let's pull all this together. What we're left with are these two competing stories, right? One is about this incredible technological and economic boom. The other is a story of tragic conquest and displacement. But the key takeaway here is that they aren't separate stories. They are two sides of the very same coin. One couldn't have happened without the other. So you have the myth, the story of the lone, rugged individual taming an empty wilderness. But the reality? The reality is a story about a nation being completely re-engineered from the top down. It was driven by corporate power, it was paid for with huge government subsidies, and it was enforced with military might.
And that really leaves us with one last thing to think about. Knowing all this, knowing about this dual legacy, this mix of commerce and conquest, innovation and injustice, how does that change the way we look at the American West? More importantly, how does it change how we understand the forces that shaped the country we all live in today?